The Iron Dragon has fallen. Every specialist in the country had already signed the papers. After 6 months of haunting silence following the ambush, Quan Min-jae, the man who once ruled the city's shadows with a single glance, was officially declared brain dead. Even as the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator forced air into his lungs, the lead surgeon's verdict was ice cold. He is gone. Prepare the paperwork to disconnect. And just like that, the last flicker of hope vanished from the high-security penthouse. Min-jae was a legend, a man whose sharp jawline and dragon-inked skin struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. His name cleared streets. His ink-stained fingers moved empires. But all the power in the world couldn't buy him the one thing he was losing: a pulse of his own. The machines were the only things keeping the dragon from the grave. As the days bled into weeks, the vultures began to circle. His loyal lieutenants stopped checking the monitors. His rivals began dividing his territory like jackals over a carcass. The sprawling penthouse, once a fortress of power, became a tomb of glass and steel. Only one person remained in the shadows, watching over him with a debt that couldn't be measured in $1 or dollars. Annie Phillips was a ghost in Min-jae's world, the maid he had once saved from a life of ruin when no one else would look her way. He hadn't cared about her lack of status or her past. He had simply given her a roof and a chance. Now, keeping his room spotless and his monitors clear was the only way she could repay a man who couldn't even hear her thank him. But the morning of the end-of-life decree brought a different kind of terror. Leona, Annie's 3-year-old daughter, was trembling. Her small body was radiating a terrifying, living fire fever. Annie's heart raced with an impossible choice. She couldn't leave her sick child alone in the servants' quarters, but if she missed her shift today, she wouldn't just lose her job. She'd lose the only protection they had left in this dangerous city. With a prayer on her lips, Annie wrapped Leona in a soft yellow dress and a thick blanket, smuggling her into the forbidden medical wing. She knew the Iron Dragon's rules. No outsiders. No children. Discovery meant immediate exile. She tucked Leona under a pile of fresh linens in the supply closet adjacent to the medical suite. "Stay quiet, my angel. Mama will be right back," she whispered. Annie stepped out to face the doctors, unaware that the smallest pair of hands in the penthouse, hot with fever and full of innocence, was about to reach through the darkness and pull a monster back to life. Thank you for coming back to the Cinem Corner channel. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe, and share. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let's continue. The hum of the medical equipment felt like a funeral dirge as Annie began her routine, her eyes darting toward the supply closet where Leona lay hidden. Every time she polished the cold marble surfaces of the penthouse, her mind drifted back to the rainy afternoon 4 years ago, the day her world had almost ended, and the Iron Dragon had given her a new one. She had been a woman with nothing, standing on a rain-slicked street corner in a neighborhood where hope went to die. A debt collector, a man with a jagged scar and breath that smelled of cheap liquor, had pinned her against a brick wall. He was screaming about interest rates and blood payments, his hand raised to strike a woman who had no one to protect her. Annie had closed her eyes, bracing for a blow that never came. Instead, a black sedan had glided to the curb like a silent predator. The back window rolled down just an inch. Quan Min-jae didn't step out. He didn't shout. He simply sat in the shadows of the velvet interior, his sharp jawline illuminated by the street lamps. His gaze, piercing, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy, fixed on the debt collector. He didn't say a single word, but the air around them seemed to freeze. The man with the scar had begun to tremble, his hand dropping as if it had been scorched. He had backed away, stammering apologies into the rain, before fleeing into the night. Min-jae's eyes had shifted to Annie for a fleeting second. In that look, there was no pity, only a silent recognition of her humanity. He had gestured to his driver, and a card had been pressed into Annie's hand. An address and a start date. He hadn't just given her a job. He had built a wall between her and the monsters of the city. Now, as she wiped the dust from the monitors surrounding his motionless form, Annie looked at the serpentine dragon winding up his neck. To the world, that ink was a warning of death. To her, it was the mark of the man who had stood between her and a life of ruin. She moved closer to the bed, her shadow falling across his pale, sharp features. He looked so fragile now, a stark contrast to the immovable force he had been that day in the rain. "I haven't forgotten, Mr. Quan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. "I know they say you can't hear me. I know they say there's no one left inside. But we're still here. I won't let them turn off the lights." A sudden, muffled cough from the supply closet made Annie's heart skip a beat. Her blood ran cold as she checked the hallway, her ears straining for the sound of the guards' heavy boots. Leona was restless, the fever likely pulling her into a hazy, uncomfortable sleep. Annie felt a surge of desperation. She was a woman trapped between two dying fires, the daughter who was her entire world, and the man who had made that world possible. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches above Min Jae's tattooed hand. The script-inked fingers that had once moved empires were now still and waxen. She wanted to take his hand, to offer some of her own strength to the man who had once been her silent shield. But the fear of the cameras and the ever-present vultures kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could only watch and wait, praying that the secret she had brought into the room wouldn't be the thing that finally broke the sanctuary he had given her. The heavy double doors of the penthouse suite groaned as they swung open, admitting a chill that had nothing to do with the central air conditioning. Annie straightened her uniform, her hands trembling as she tucked her cleaning cloth into her apron. The vultures had arrived. They didn't walk like mourners. They moved like predators entering a clearing where a lion had finally collapsed. The first was Chairman O, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Behind him followed a small entourage of lieutenants, their suits sharp enough to cut, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. They claimed to be there to pay their respects to the Iron Dragon, but as they bypassed Min Jae's mother and headed straight for the medical monitors, their true intent was naked. They weren't looking at a friend. They were looking at a vacancy. "Such a tragedy," O remarked, his voice smooth and devoid of genuine grief. He stood at the foot of the bed, his shadow stretching over Min Jae's unmoving form. He leaned in closer, his gaze lingering on the dragon tattoo that crested Min Jae's collarbone. To see the man who held the 4 districts in his palm reduced to a collection of blinking lights and plastic tubes. Annie moved to the bedside table, pretending to adjust a tray of medical supplies just so she could stand between the intruders and the supply closet. Every breath she took felt like lead. The tension in the room was suffocating, a thick layer of unspoken threats and shifting loyalties. She could feel Chairman O's eyes shift toward her, a momentary flick of dismissal, before returning to the patient. To them, she was part of the furniture, a witness with no voice. "The board is impatient, Chairman," one of the younger lieutenants whispered, loud enough for the room to hear. "The territories are restless. Without a signature or a word, the Iron Dragon is just a ghost haunting a high-rise." Chairman O reached out, his hand hovering near the ventilator's power switch in a gesture that made Annie's stomach churn. He wasn't checking the equipment. He was testing the air, seeing if anyone, a guard, a family member, or God himself, would stop him. The silence that followed was agonizing. The only sound was the mechanical hiss-click of the machine, a rhythmic reminder that Min Jae's life was being measured in volts and air pressure. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo the secret life hidden just feet away. In the supply closet, Leona stirred. A soft, muffled rustle of fabric came from behind the door. Chairman O's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the closet. "Is the ventilation acting up? Or do I hear breathing that doesn't belong to a machine?" O asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. Annie stepped forward, her pulse thundering in her ears. "I was just organizing the linens earlier, sir," she said, her voice small but steady. "The pipes in this wing, they sometimes hum when the pressure changes." The chairman stared at her for a long, soul-withering moment, his lips curling into a thin, predatory line. He didn't believe her, but he didn't care enough to investigate a servant's excuses, not when a billion-dollar empire was ripe for the taking. He turned back to Min Jae, a final, mocking bow. "Rest well, Min Jae. The city won't wait much longer for you to die." As the men filed out, their laughter echoing in the hollow hallway, Annie collapsed against the bed frame. The vultures had seen what they wanted, a fallen king. But as she looked at Min Jae's pale face, she felt a flare of defiance. They thought the dragon was dead, but they didn't know about the spark of life waiting in the dark. The echo of Chairman O's departure had barely faded before the silence of the penthouse was punctured by a sound that made Annie's blood run cold. It wasn't the hum of the pipes or the hiss of the ventilator, but a low, jagged moan of distress coming from behind the supply closet door. Annie scrambled across the marble floor, her knees hitting the wood as she pulled the door open. Leona was no longer sleeping. She was tossing fitfully against the piles of linen, her simple yellow dress damp with sweat and clinging to her small, trembling frame. When Annie pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead, she gasped. The heat was no longer a simmer. It was a forest fire. The child's skin felt like it was radiating its own sun, and her eyes, usually bright and full of questions, were glazed and unfocused. Desperation, sharp and acidic, rose in Annie's throat. She had called the community shelters during her break, only to be met with the same robotic recording. Full capacity. No beds available. The public clinics were a 12-hour wait in a crowded hall, and the private hospitals were a fantasy, demanding a down payment that surpassed a year of her wages. In a city of soaring glass towers, there was no room for a sick child with a mother who wore a service apron. "Mama's here, Leona. Just breathe, my angel," Annie whispered, her voice cracking as she wrapped the child back in the thin blanket. She couldn't stay here. The security detail was due for their shift change, and the vultures had left the atmosphere in the penthouse volatile. If a guard found a child in the medical wing, especially a sick one, Annie wouldn't just be fired. She would be seen as a security breach in a Mafia stronghold. But she couldn't take Leona back to their cramped, unventilated room in the basement. The air there was thick and stagnant, and Leona needed the clinical coolness of the upper floors to survive the night. Moving with the frantic grace of a cornered animal, Annie lifted Leona and slipped out of the room. She bypassed the main hallway, ducking into the narrow, industrial corridor that housed the service elevator. It was a metal cage, hidden behind a heavy steel door, used only for laundry and waste. It was the only place where the cameras were blind and the guards never lingered. She stepped inside the elevator and pressed the emergency stop, locking the car between the 44th and 45th floors. The metal walls were cool to the touch. Annie sat on the floor, pulling Leona onto her lap. The yellow fabric of the dress looked like a wilted flower against the gray steel. Leona's breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. She clutched at Annie's hand, her tiny fingers hot and dry. "It's too loud, Mama," the girl whimpered, her delirium mistaking the silence of the elevator for a roar. "The heart is tapping. Can you hear the heart?" Annie rocked her, tears finally spilling over as she looked at the numbers on the panel. Upward lay the billionaire's sanctuary, where machines fought to keep a ghost alive. Downward lay the street, where no one would stop for a maid and her dying child. Stuck in the middle, Annie held her daughter tighter, realizing that the only thing keeping them both tethered to this world was a man who couldn't even open his eyes. She had to get Leona closer to the medical wing's cooling units, but the risk was a precipice. "Just a little longer," she sobbed into Leona's curls. "Just a little longer." The service elevator shuddered as Annie released the emergency brake, the mechanical groan sounding like a scream in the stillness of the service corridor. She knew she was stepping into the mouth of the beast. The penthouse medical suite was no longer just a room. It was the dead zone, a place where the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the looming presence of a fallen king. But as Leona's breath hitched, a jagged, shallow sound that tore through Annie's chest, the risk of discovery became secondary to the terror of the fever. Annie slipped through the rear staff entrance, her back pressed against the cold wallpaper. The penthouse was eerily quiet, the predatory energy of the rival bosses having left a lingering, toxic chill. Every floorboard that creaked under her weight felt like a gunshot. She reached the threshold of the medical suite, the blue-tinged light from the monitors spilling across the floor like a shallow pool of water. Inside, Quan Min-jae lay as still as a statue, his chest rising and falling with a rhythmic, artificial click. Panic flared in her throat when she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots at the far end of the hallway. The security detail was ahead of schedule. There was no time to return to the laundry closet. With a desperate strength born of pure adrenaline, Annie ducked behind the floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains that framed the massive windows overlooking the city. The fabric was heavy, a deep, midnight blue that smelled faintly of dust and expensive cologne. She collapsed onto the floor in the narrow gap between the glass and the velvet, pulling Leona tight against her. The child was burning, a radiant heat that seemed to seep through Annie's uniform. Leona's small hands clutched at the soft yellow fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. "The tapping, Mama?" Leona murmured, her voice a ghostly thread. "The man is calling the tapping." "Sure, my sweet girl. Just sleep," Annie pleaded, pressing her cheek against Leona's damp forehead. Through the sliver where the curtains met, Annie watched as a guard entered the room. The beam of his flashlight swept across the medical equipment, dancing over the dragon tattoo on Min-jae's neck and the script-inked fingers resting on the white sheets. The light brushed the edge of the velvet curtain, and Annie held her breath until her lungs burned, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The guard grunted, satisfied with the silence of the tomb, and retreated, the heavy click of the door signaling his exit. But the reprieve brought no peace. Leona was slipping further into the delirium of the fever. She began to kick weakly at the blanket, her tiny body struggling against the heat that was consuming her. "It's too hot, Mama. I want the cool bed," she whimpered. Before Annie could catch her, Leona's small, determined hands pushed through the heavy folds of the curtain. The girl didn't see the danger or the Mafia boss. She saw only the vast, white expanse of the bed and the promise of a place to rest. Annie reached out, her fingers grazing the yellow hem of Leona's dress, but it was too late. The child had already begun to crawl toward the rhythmic beep of the machines, moving toward the only other heartbeat in the room. The heavy velvet curtains swayed as Leona slipped through their folds, her movements fluid and ghost-like in the dim, blue light of the medical suite. To her fever-clouded mind, the world had transformed into a landscape of shifting shadows and rhythmic pulses. The steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor wasn't a mechanical warning to her. It was a companion. In the hazy, sweltering heat of her delirium, she believed the sound was a heartbeat calling out from across a vast, white ocean. A drumbeat leading her toward the only cool place left in a world on fire. Back in the shadows of the supply alcove, Annie was paralyzed by a new terror. The door had hissed open again, but it wasn't the guards this time. Two doctors, their white coats stark and clinical, had entered for the final midnight assessment. Their voices were low, hushed tones of professional resignation as they discussed the morning's grim schedule. Annie pressed herself into the smallest possible space, her eyes fixed on the doctor's silhouettes, her breath hitching in her throat. She was so focused on the threat in front of her, so desperate to remain a shadow among shadows, that she didn't feel the sudden absence of the small, radiating warmth that had been pressed against her side just seconds before. Leona moved across the marble floor, the cool stone beneath her knees providing a fleeting moment of relief. The yellow fabric of her dress whispered against the floor, a sound so faint it was swallowed by the hum of the cooling fans. Her eyes were fixed on the bed. To her, Kwon Min-jae didn't look like a feared man of the shadows. He looked like a figure of stone, a mountain waiting for the rain. The tubes and wires were merely vines, and the rhythmic beeping was the mountain's slow, steady pulse. "I hear you," she murmured, though the words were nothing more than a soft exhale of breath. Her head throbbed with the intensity of the fever, making the room tilt and spin. She reached the edge of the high bed, her tiny hands finding purchase on the thick, expensive linens. With a strength born of feverish determination, she began to pull herself up. Every inch was a struggle, her muscles trembling, her skin slick with sweat. She wasn't thinking of the danger or the doctors standing just a few yards away, hidden by the high back of a medical chair. She was only thinking of the rhythm. As she finally tumbled onto the soft expanse of the mattress, the transition from the cold floor to the sterile warmth of the bed made her vision swim. She saw the dragon on the man's neck, its scales shimmering in the light of the monitors. She didn't see a monster. She saw a guardian. Slowly, she crawled toward the center of the bed, her small body seeking the source of the sound. She didn't realize that she was crossing the final boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ghost. By the time Annie realized the curtain was empty, Leona had already reached the dragon's side, guided by a dream that science could never map. Leona's small, fever-flushed hands reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the back of the man's hand resting atop the sheets. In the hazy glow of the pulse oximeter, The dark ink etched into his skin didn't look like the mark of a criminal underworld or a warning of violence. To her innocent eyes, the intricate script and the bold symbols snaking down his fingers were like the illustrations in the storybooks Annie used to read her. Hidden maps and secret patterns waiting to be explored. She traced the curve of a character on his knuckle, her touch as light as a falling leaf. "Pretty?" she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. The man remained a statue, his sharp jawline set in a permanent mask of stillness. But Leona wasn't afraid of the silence. In her delirium, the coldness radiating from him felt wrong, a stark contrast to the fire consuming her own blood. She remembered how Annie would hold her when she had a nightmare, pressing her close until the shivering stopped. Believing this tired man was simply lost in a cold dream of his own, she decided he shouldn't be alone. With agonizing slowness, she maneuvered her small frame closer to his side. The movement was a struggle. Her limbs felt like they were made of lead, and every breath was a heavy chore. But the pull of the heartbeat, the rhythmic beep that felt so much like a drum, drew her in. She finally collapsed against his chest, her head finding a natural hollow just below his shoulder. The soft yellow fabric of her dress bunched up as she tucked one arm between them, seeking the anchor of his solid, unmoving presence. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, her eyes drifting shut as the sterile scent of the hospital bed mixed with the faint, lingering aroma of expensive sandalwood that clung to him. She didn't see the jagged dragon winding up his neck or the scars of a life lived in the shadows. She only felt the rise and fall of a chest that was finally beginning to react to her presence. The heat from her body began to seep through the thin fabric of his hospital gown, a natural, living warmth pressing against the stagnant chill of his skin. "I'll stay here," she murmured into the stillness, her words slurring as sleep finally claimed her. "Don't be cold anymore." As she drifted off, her small heart beating a frantic, feverish tempo against his silent one. The room seemed to hold its breath. The machines continued their mechanical work, but for the first time in 6 months, there was something in that bed that no medical textbook could categorize. A bridge of pure, unintended heat. Hidden by the high rails and the shadows of the medical monitors, the child and the Mafia boss lay locked in a strange, silent embrace. A tiny, glowing ember resting on the heart of a dormant volcano. Below the surface of the Iron Dragon's skin, the first tremors of a long-buried instinct began to stir. The silence of the medical suite was no longer empty. It was filled with the invisible, frantic energy of a biological collision. As Leona drifted into a deep, fever-induced sleep, her small body became a literal hearth, radiating a fierce and concentrated heat directly into Quan Min Jae's chest. For months, the Iron Dragon had been a landscape of permafrost, his internal systems slowed to a glacial crawl, kept in a state of artificial preservation by the cold precision of machines. But now, the intense warmth of the child acted like a thermal shock to his dormant nerves. Deep within the darkened architecture of Min Jae's brain, the first sparks began to fly. It started as a microscopic tremor, a sudden surge of electrical activity triggered by the foreign, living heat pressed against his heart. The skin-to-skin contact, amplified by the child's elevated temperature, bypassed the clinical barriers of the medical equipment. It was a primitive, visceral jumpstart, the raw energy of a life in overdrive attempting to pull a failing life back from the brink. On the complex array of monitors surrounding the bed, the change was subtle at first. A flat, gray line on the neuroactivity display began to ripple. Then, a faint, amber glow illuminated the screen as the readings climbed out of the dead zone. The sensors taped to Min Jae's temples picked up a sudden, violent burst of synaptic firing. It was as if a long-dormant engine had suddenly been flooded with fuel. The biological shock of the feverish child was forcing his heart to work harder, his blood to circulate faster, and his brain to recognize a presence that wasn't a needle or a tube. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, which had been a steady, mechanical drone for 6 months, suddenly faltered. It skipped a beat, then another, before resetting into a faster, more aggressive tempo. It was no longer the sound of a machine breathing for a man. It was the sound of a man trying to breathe for himself. The heat from Leona's body continued to pour into him, a relentless tide of vitality that refused to let his system remain stagnant. In the shadows, the brain activity monitor's glow intensified, casting a rhythmic, pulsing light across the dragon tattoo on Min-jae's neck. The serpentine scales seemed to shimmer and move as the muscles beneath them twitched for the first time since the ambush. The Iron Dragon was no longer a statue of ice. Beneath the weight of the sleeping child in the yellow dress, the man who had been declared dead was experiencing a silent, internal explosion of life. The thermal bridge between them had become a lifeline, a biological conduit that was dragging his consciousness back through the layers of darkness, toward the small, burning sun resting on his chest. The heavy, clinical tread of boots echoed in the hallway, signaling the arrival of the finality Annie had dreaded. The double doors swung open, admitting the head of neurology and a senior technician. They carried no charts, only the cold, metallic weight of the equipment used to transition a body from life support to the silence of the grave. The lead doctor's face was a mask of professional detachment, his hand already reaching for the primary console to begin the shutdown sequence. Time of cessation, 0500. The doctor began, his voice hollow in the vast room. He moved to the side of the bed, but as he reached for the main ventilator lead, he froze. His eyes widened, his hand hovering mid-air as he looked down at the monitors. The neuroactivity display was no longer flat. It was a chaotic, brilliant web of firing synapses, a storm of amber light that defied every physiological law he had spent decades studying. What is this? The technician whispered, his voice cracking. The readings, they're off the charts. It's like his brain just ignited. Only then did they see her. Tucked beneath the shadows of the medical railing, a small girl was curled into the crook of Min-jae's arm, her head resting directly over his heart. The soft fabric of her dress was a sharp, defiant contrast to the sterile white of the sheets. The doctors stood in a paralyzed state of horror, realizing that a child had breached the most secure medical wing in the city. But the horror was instantly replaced by a breathtaking awe. The heart monitor's rhythm shifted from a mechanical pulse to a frantic, heavy thrum. Suddenly, the man who had been a statue for half a year experienced a violent, singular twitch. His fingers, the ones covered in dark, symbolic ink, curled reflexively, his hand coming to rest protectively over the small girl's back. Then it happened. Kwon Min-jae's eyelids fluttered, a struggle visible in the fine muscles of his face. With a sharp, sudden intake of breath that bypassed the rhythm of the ventilator, his eyes snapped open. There was no hazy period of confusion, no slow drift into consciousness. His gaze was immediate, sharp, and intensely focused. He didn't look at the doctors or the needles in his arms. He didn't look at the luxury penthouse that had become his tomb. His eyes locked onto the small, curly-haired girl sleeping peacefully on his chest. In that moment, the Iron Dragon didn't wake up to seek vengeance or reclaim a throne. He woke up with the visceral, primal instinct of a guardian. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of his own heart beating, a real, human sound that drowned out the machines. As his tattooed hand tightened ever so slightly around the child, the doctors realized they weren't witnessing a medical recovery. They were witnessing a resurrection. The dragon had returned, and he had found something worth coming back for. The clinical coldness of the penthouse was permanently shattered, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the central heating and everything to do with the two lives that now occupied the center of Kwon Min-jae's world. The Iron Dragon had returned, but the man who emerged from the shadows of the coma was transformed. The ruthlessness that had once defined his reign was now a tempered steel, redirected into a singular, unwavering purpose: the absolute protection of those who had reached into the darkness to pull him back. The vultures who had circled his bed during his silence were systematically purged, not with the blind violence of a mob boss, but with the calculated precision of a man who had seen the true face of loyalty. Chairman O and his conspirators vanished from the city's power structures, replaced by a new order that prioritized the silent bonds of debt over the loud treachery of greed. The underworld whispered of a change in the dragon, a new code that was written in the ink of his resurrected heart. Annie no longer walked the service corridors in a hidden apron. By a decree that no one in the organization dared to question, she and Leona were moved from the cramped, airless maid's quarters to the sun-drenched family wing of the penthouse. The service elevator was forgotten, replaced by grand halls where Leona's laughter echoed off the marble that had once been as silent as a tomb. In the quiet evenings, Min-jae would sit on the terrace, His sharp jawline softened as he watched Leona run across the garden in a new yellow dress, her curls catching the golden hour light. He would look down at his hands, the script-inked fingers that had once only known how to grasp for power, and realize they were now meant to hold a future. Annie stood by his side, no longer a ghost in his house, but a pillar of his new empire. They didn't need words to acknowledge what had happened in that medical suite. The dragon had been declared dead by the world, but he had been saved by the smallest, most innocent spark. As Min-jae felt the steady, healthy rhythm of his own heart, he knew he was no longer just a ruler of shadows. He was a guardian, and he had found his angel in a child who believed that even monsters deserved to be warm. The Iron Dragon's resurrection proved that the soul is not moved by the weight of gold, but by the weight of a hand held in the dark. In a world that measures worth by status and power, it was the invisible who possessed the true currency of life. Annie's unwavering gratitude and Leona's pure, boundaryless innocence accomplished what billions could not. The lesson remains: never underestimate those the world overlooks. For sometimes, the strength to move mountains resides not in the hands of the mighty, but in the quiet heart of a child. We have come to the end of this story. Do you have someone who held your hand when you were going through some tough times? Now is the time to call them and say you are grateful. Also, do not forget to like and subscribe to the Cinema Corner channel. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you another story.